Hey, today we're going to kick off this episode with a little visual representation of what 2020 fantasy football has been like for so many people. So in order to do that, I brought a couple props, right? I got this big inflated red balloon here. Now, this balloon represents all of your fantasy football knowledge, right? However many years you've played this game, the history of it, the facts behind it, the consistency behind things that you kind of look for, the trends. It's all represented inside of this balloon. This is 2020. 2020 don't give a shit. What is going on, Headliner Nation? Jake, Fantasy Headliners. Hopefully everybody's doing well out there today, where we're talking about running backs here in Week 9 fantasy football that we should start or sit. And we're not going to get too cute with it, right? Between all the injuries and the bye weeks, right? We got a few teams on bye this week. We got the Los Angeles Rams, Cincinnati Bengals, Philadelphia Eagles, Cleveland Browns. So if you have any of those players, make sure you adjust your rosters accordingly. So between the bye weeks and the injuries, we can't afford to get too cute. We can't sit some of these guys that have just kind of underperformed as of late. We got to continue to roll them out there and cross our fingers, and that's what we're going to be talking about here today. Each running back in each matchup. However, before we do, how did we do last week in Week 8? Let's pull up the stats here real quick. And was Week 8 our best week? No, absolutely not. Out of the 53 players that we gave a start or sit designation to, we got 34 of them correct for an accuracy percentage of 64%. Overall, Week 8 absolutely sucked for fantasy football, and some of the biggest misses was the Indianapolis Colts backfield, right? Jonathan Taylor came out, didn't do good. All of a sudden, in comes Jordan Wilkins, Nyheim Hines, and they absolutely capitalized off that matchup. Zach Moss found the end zone a couple times. He was a huge surprise. What about Damian Harris? The guy, racks up yardage, racks up fantasy points when he gets touches. He did this last week. He was a miss. One of our hits, Philip Lindsay. I mentioned him in this episode last week and said, listen, if this dude clears concussion protocol, this is the better option in the backfield. Philip Lindsay continues to be efficient. DJ Dallas, another hit for us because we knew that nobody else was going to be active in Seattle. They had to use him, and they did. Gus Edwards continues to be the guy-ish, at least volume-wise, with no Mark Ingram. J.K. Dobbins looked great himself, and all of a sudden the Baltimore running game actually looked better without Mark Ingram. What do we do going forward? We'll talk about that here in a second, because now is the time that we're going to dive into all of the Week 9 matchups, and we're going to kick it off on Thursday Night Football. And that's where we're going to find the Green Bay Packers, San Francisco 49ers, and it's not going to start off with an easy take here to start the week, right? Why? Well, we don't even know if we're going to have Aaron Jones, so let me get this straight. Right now, we're looking at a matchup of Jerick McKinnon and JaMycal Hasty versus Tyler Ervin and Dexter Williams. Some of you guys out there are probably going, who the hell are those guys? Yeah, that's the potential matchup here this week, because as of right now, it does not look good for Aaron Jones to be there on Thursday Night Football. We know we have no Jamal Williams, and we know we have no A.J. Dillon. They've already been ruled out under the COVID protocols. So Ervin and Williams is what we're looking at here in Green Bay, and there's not a whole lot to really go off of, right? Tyler Ervin has 10 career carries. Dexter Williams, 5 career carries. Now, Ervin maybe a little bit more involved in the passing game, Williams more on the ground and between the tackles, but it's not an easy matchup. San Francisco allows the second fewest fantasy points per game to opposing running backs at only 13.4 fantasy points per game. Honestly, I could just see Aaron Rodgers say piss on it and go out there and throw the ball all 4 quarters, mainly to Davante Adams once again this week. Now, if Aaron Jones is active and does play, he's in your starting lineup. If he doesn't, and you have to take a stab on somebody, I'm more likely to take a stab off of Dexter Williams than I am Tyler Ervin, just based off of volume. It's going to be a huge risk, and you need to know that going in, though. Now, for San Francisco, at least it's a good matchup, right? I mean, Green Bay does allow over 29 fantasy points per game. That's the most in the NFL to opposing running backs, but no Tevin Coleman, no Jeff Wilson, no Raheem Mostert. And last week we saw JaMycal Hasty out-touch Jerick McKinnon 13-7, but didn't do a whole lot with it, right? Now, with no Jimmy G, no George Kittle, no Deebo Samuel, maybe we'll get to see more Jerick McKinnon involved in the passing game like we did earlier in the season. In my opinion, Jerick McKinnon, more of a deeper league PPR option. JaMychal Hasty should still lead this backfield on the ground in carries, and that's the guy who I feel is more safer to start this week. Like I said, though, a deeper league, anything 12 teams or larger, a PPR style format, I think Jerick McKinnon has a little bit more value there for you just due to them missing so many weapons. I mean, I think everybody is almost hurt in San Francisco at this point. They've all but basically mailed it in rest of the season, and it's not going to be pretty here for the next few weeks. If you need somebody, I'm going JaMychal Hasty. Larger leagues, I don't hate Jerick McKinnon. All right, now move over to Sunday. We got the Denver Broncos, Atlanta Falcons, and honestly, the Atlanta Falcons defense is way better. It's much improved since the firing of Dan Quinn. In fact, right now, they're only allowing right around 16 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs, which is 10th fewest in the NFL. As of late, Melvin Gordon been a little bit more involved in the passing game, but Phillip Lindsay has looked great on the ground. Now, Gordon's averaging right around 5 targets a game over his last 4 games played, but on the ground, Lindsay is averaging over 10 yards a carry over his last 2 games. He just looks better on the ground than Melvin Gordon. Plus, we know that Melvin Gordon has a hard time holding on to the football here as of late. One of the biggest issues is the volume in the running game, right? It's not consistent in Denver. Yeah, they'll have some big weeks where they'll go out there and they'll rush the ball 20, 30 times, and then sometimes it just kind of disappears. It's not consistent. If it was, we'd be looking at more running back 2 floors for these guys, but really more of a flex play with running back 2 upside on a weekly basis. With injuries and bye weeks, I have no issue starting either one of these guys here this week. For Atlanta, you got Todd Gurley, right? He's currently running back 6 overall. But how low is the scoring in fantasy football this year? He's running back 6 and only averaging 14.4 fantasy points per game in half PPR scoring. Why is he really that high still? It's touchdowns, right? He's second in the NFL right now in touchdowns with 8 rushing touchdowns on the season. It's not really due to his rushing upside, right? Because he hasn't been overly efficient, only averaging right around 3.8 yards per carry. Now, right now, Denver allowing 14.5 fantasy points per game, right where Todd Gurley averages. That is 5th fewest in the NFL, though, so a very solid run defense for Denver. He needs to continue to find the end zone, and if he does, he continues to be a great start. With where Todd Gurley's at right now, you can't afford to sit him. We just need him to find the end zone here in Week 9. On to Seattle and Buffalo now, and it was great to see Devin Singletary and Zach Moss both be efficient in this backfield for Buffalo in Week 8. Both of them had 14 carries on the ground, both averaged over 6 yards per carry. The issue is neither one of them were overly active in the passing game, which really hurts their floor on a weekly basis. It makes them very touchdown dependent, which was fine for Zach Moss in Week 8. Why? He found the touchdowns, but is it going to be like that every single week? This week they have a matchup going up against Seattle, who allows on average 17.5 fantasy points per game. But they're one of the best offenses in all of football, and that's going to force Buffalo to continue to keep pace and have to continue to move the ball down the field in big chunks. Does that mean that Devin Singletary and Zach Moss see more work in the passing game this week? Possibly, but the one thing we do know, it's a pretty even split, right? Neither one of these guys look to be the bell cow in this offense, so it's all going to come down to who scores the touchdown, which means there's risk there on a weekly basis. Both of these guys, flex options for me here. They'll be a start, but they're not a high-end start for me. They'll be towards the bottom of my top 30 here this week. For Seattle, back to the waiting game, right? Because we still don't know for sure about Chris Carson, and we won't know for a while. He's not even going to attempt to practice until Friday, which means we got some waiting to do. We also know Hyde's still dealing with that lingering hamstring issue. How is Travis Homer progressing? We could see a lot of DJ Dallas once again, and he produced last week, right? Ish. I mean, he was saved by touchdowns, though. He only averaged 2.28 yards per carry and only had 58 total yards. Going up against Buffalo, who allows over 20 fantasy points per game, I would love to start Chris Carson, and if he's active and good to go by the weekend, I will throw him into my lineup. If he's not, DJ Dallas is the guy that I'll bank on here in this backfield this week for the Seattle Seahawks. Ravens and Colts now, and that's the running game we like to see for the Baltimore Ravens, right? We had Gus Edwards, 16 carries, 87 yards and a touchdown. J.K. Dobbins, 15 carries for $113 versus the Pittsburgh Steelers last week. Now they get a matchup going up against the Indianapolis Colts, who allowed just over 14 fantasy points per game, 4th best in the NFL. but maybe because of the production we saw last week, now they don't have to rush Mark Ingram back for any reason, right? Give him an extra week or two, let him really get back to 100% health, and just ride Gus and JK here for the next few weeks, because it's obvious they can handle it. That's something we need to pay attention to here throughout the rest of the week, the status of Mark Ingram. If Ingram plays, it's going to hurt the ceiling of Gus and JK. If Ingram sits, both these guys, Gus Edwards, J.K. Dobbins, solid flex plays once again in Week 9. What about for the Colts? This has to be one of the most disappointing things for me in fantasy football in a while. Jonathan Taylor has the makings of being a great running back, but for right now, he just doesn't have it. Now, at the end of the game, it came out from Phillip Rivers that JT was nicked up, I believe was his exact quote. But then they interviewed head coach Frank Reich later on. He said, listen, I didn't even know the guy was hurt. That's not why they pulled him. They basically benched him in the second half because Jordan Wilkins and Nyheim Hines were just playing so great. That is very worrisome. Going forward, this backfield could very well kind of take that hot hand approach, giving Jordan Wilkins the lead back role as of right now, and Nyheim Hines a little bit more in the passing game. Now, going up against Baltimore, they allowed just over 18 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. But if you had to get my opinion as of right now, looks like Jordan Wilkins is going to be the lead back in Indianapolis until Jonathan Taylor can really get going. The biggest issue with Taylor is decision making, or the lack thereof, right? He just isn't hitting the hole and he's not making decisions fast enough, and it's causing his yards per carry and his efficiency to absolutely plummet. That's something they're going to have to work on him with, but for right now, Jordan Wilkins seems like the guy in this backfield and the safest bet to start on a weekly basis. On to Houston and Jacksonville, and it's nice to have both James Robinson and David Johnson back for our fantasy lineups here this week, but no Gardner Minshew under center for the Jacksonville Jaguars this week. Nope, they'll be starting rookie quarterback Jake Luton, a big, strong-armed quarterback that's going to stay in the pocket and try to deliver the ball down the field. But with rookie quarterbacks, like usual, they like to rely a little bit more on their running backs, which is great because we need to get James Robinson the ball early and often, whether it's on the ground or through the air. He's proven to be efficient both ways. He's had at least 16 touches in every single game this season. He's got at least 4 targets a game since week 2. Now, as of right now, Houston's allowing over 27 fantasy points per game, third most in the NFL. This is a great matchup for James Robinson. The biggest issue I see here is if Jake Luton can't keep this game close and they fall behind early, we may see less work on the ground for James Robinson, which would limit his ceiling. Still going to be a start, though. We can't afford to sit him in a week like this. For David Johnson and the Houston Texans, I love this start, and he's going to be my Manscaped start of the week here this week. Coming off the bye week, should be fully healthy. Jacksonville allows over 23 fantasy points per game, which is 6th most in the NFL. He's had at least 18 touches in his last 4 games. He's averaging right around 12.2 fantasy points per game, currently running back 18 overall, but most importantly, he's still out targeting Duke Johnson in the passing game. Over their last 4 games, David Johnson actually has 1 more target than Duke Johnson. So he's the guy being a little bit involved, not only on the ground, but through the air also. I look for a heavy dose of David Johnson this week. And kind of like I mentioned a little bit earlier here with James Robinson, if they can't keep this game close, we could see Houston with a big second half lead, relying a lot more on David Johnson. That's why I got him a little bit higher in my Manscaped start of the week here in week 9. Panthers and Chiefs, and all signs are finally pointing to the return of Christian McCaffrey. Yes, hopefully you get him back for your fantasy football lineups here this week. And if he plays, he starts for your fantasy team. He's been out since week 3, and you have missed him ever since. Going up against Kansas City, they allow around 18 fantasy points per game, and it doesn't really matter. A healthy Christian McCaffrey is an automatic must start in fantasy football. Just make sure you pay attention to the practice reports all throughout the week. As for Kansas City, this one is almost as big of a head scratcher as the Indianapolis backfield from last week. I think we all kind of assumed Kansas City would get a big lead, right? Well, they did. They ended up winning 35-9. But we only saw 12 total carries between CEH and Le'Veon Bell. They got the lead, but they just chose not to run the ball on the ground their second half as much. They continued to throw the ball. Now, as of right now, Clyde Edwards-Helaire still leading that backfield with over 50% of the snaps. The Panthers, they allowed 23 fantasy points per game, 4th most in the NFL on the ground to running backs. But who's it going to be in this backfield? They really limit each other's ceiling now. The touches aren't overly high for either one of these guys. It makes it one of those issues to where you don't know which one to start on a weekly basis. As of right now, being that CEH is still getting more touches, more snaps in this offense, he's going to remain the start for me. Le'Veon Bell is going to be more of a deep league play until he can show that he's going to get more volume on a weekly basis. Yes, that should happen at some point this season. Expected it last week in a huge lead. It did not. So as of right now, CEH will continue to get the start. We'll sit Lev Bell until we can see more volume every single week. Lions and Vikings, and Dalvin Cook is out here just winning matchups for people, right? He does not care. He's just putting up points. Currently, running back 2 in fantasy football, only trailing Alvin Kamara, but has played in one less game than Kamara. The guy's putting up huge numbers, averaging just over 25 fantasy points per game. Right now, the Lions allow 27 fantasy points per game, third most in the NFL. I'm looking for another big day for Dalvin Cook. You're not going to sit him regardless. For Detroit, still one of those backfields that makes you scratch your head, right? I mean, they have a better matchup this week, at least going up against Minnesota. They allow right around 18 fantasy points per game. And for the third straight week, DeAndre Swift's snap percentage has continued to climb. They're slowly giving him more work or more opportunity in this backfield, I guess I should say. And now, with no Kenny G out there on the outside, maybe we see DeAndre Swift a little bit more active in this short passing game moving forward. He's who I feel most confident with. I'll start DeAndre Swift, but as for Kerryon Johnson or Adrian Peterson, pass. On to Chicago and Tennessee now, and not the easiest of matchups for Derrick Henry in this one, going up against the Chicago Bears defense, but does it matter? Hell no, it doesn't matter. It's Derrick Henry. In 7 games so far this season, 161 carries for 775 yards and 8 touchdowns. Currently running back 3 in fantasy football, averaging over 20 fantasy points per game. We always talk about how volume is king, and Henry gets it. He's an automatic must-start every single week. For Chicago, we saw David Montgomery get 20 carries on the ground. A little applause for him actually getting 20 carries. Not overly efficient, but we also saw him get at least 5 targets a game once again for his 5th straight game. It's like they're slowly getting him more involved. The problem is this offense doesn't put him in too many opportunities to score touchdowns, and that's what's really limiting the ceiling at this point. Now, Tennessee, they do allow over 21 fantasy points per game. Not a bad matchup for David Montgomery, and he's going to stay firmly right here once again in the start column. Giants and football team of Washington up next, and you'll get Antonio Gibson back for Washington here this week. Don't forget, this guy coming off a bye week had a huge week before the bye where he saw 20 carries there on the ground, a season high. Do they continue that trend here throughout the rest of the season? Very possible. He does have 4 touchdowns out of his last 6 games played, and now a matchup going up against the Giants, who allow 17 fantasy points per game. Not a bad matchup, not a huge split in touches in this backfield. I'll go ahead and start Antonio Gibson here once again. What about for the Giants? I mean, do we get Devonta Freeman back? I mean, we saw Alfred Morris this past week. What about Wayne Gallman, Dion Lewis? There's a lot of options here that, honestly, none of them have that high of a ceiling, and none of them really make me that excited, especially going up against the football team who only allows right around 15.5 fantasy football points per game to opposing running backs, which is top 10. I would prefer to sit this entire backfield. Why? They don't produce a whole lot. They're not winning a whole lot. And honestly, there's just so many options. They're all capping each other's ceiling. Raiders and Chargers now, and for Los Angeles, it seems like Justin Jackson is the leader in this backfield as of right now. Last week, outsnapped Joshua Kelly 41-21. He had 20 touches, which he turned into 142 total yards, and Joshua Kelly just isn't doing enough with the opportunities that he's been given. Somebody who did take advantage of an opportunity, Tremaine Pope of the Chargers. Maybe you have no idea who he is. Well, he came in last week, had 10 carries for 67 yards, also had 5 receptions for 28 yards. Get used to the name Tremaine Pope. This is a guy who can have a role in this offense until the return of Austin Eckler, whenever that may be. If you have a spot on the bottom of your bench and Tremaine Pope is available, he's somebody who I would consider adding here just to see what happens in the coming weeks. Do I want to start him this week? I really don't want to. It all depends on the options you have. If you're in a deeper league, a PPR type of league, I don't hate it. I would prefer to just stick with Justin Jackson at this point, though. Going up against the Raiders, they allow 23 fantasy points per game, 5th most in the NFL. Justin Jackson is the safest bet, in my opinion, in this backfield as of right now. Now, for the Raiders, it was great to see Josh Jacobs go out there and get 31 carries, right? Which he did turn around and put up 128 rushing yards because of it. Now, he gets a matchup going up against the Chargers, who allow just over 17 fantasy points per game. But could Josh Jacobs be in line for a little bit more passing work going forward? Because as of late, he hasn't really seen it. He is right now currently running back 10 overall in fantasy football, and not a name that you can afford to sit in a matchup like this week. On to Miami and Arizona, and it's time, right? It's Chase Edmonds' time for the Arizona Cardinals. No Kenyon Drake. He's out. He's injured. We should see a lot of Chase Edmonds here in the coming weeks. And he already had a large portion of the passing work. Now he's going to get a crack at the early down work between the tackles. And remember, he's auditioning for a full-time job. Kenyon Drake could be gone end of the season, which means Chase Edmonds could go out here, light the world on fire, and be the potential starting running back for the Arizona Cardinals next season. And he gets a great opportunity going up against Miami. They allow over 21.5 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs, 7th most in the NFL. This is why you held on to Edmonds, right? For this exact reason, now's the time to start him. For Miami, kind of got some breaking news, right? I love the matchup this week for Myles Gaskin, but the news just came out that he's going to miss the next 3 games at least with an MCL sprain. This is something we kind of need to pay attention to, right? Myles Gaskin had been a super solid flex play all season long. He was getting over 20 touches a game. The touchdown upside wasn't really there, but he was involved in the passing game, and now they're not going to have him. What are they going to utilize here in the coming weeks? Well, they brought in DeAndre Washington, but this week, if I had to bank on anybody, more than likely it's Matt Breida. How much more volume does Jordan Howard get? Maybe they involve Lynn Bowden a little bit. This backfield's going to be a little bit of a mess here for the next few weeks. It could be a handful of guys that all get touches. If I had to bank on anybody this week, I'm going to go with Matt Breida and cross my fingers. Arizona allows almost 20 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. And as of right now, Matt Breida was second in line behind Gaskin in this backfield. It's not pretty, it's not safe, but if you're looking for a start to replace Gaskin, Breida's going to be the guy that I choose here in Week 9. Steelers and Cowboys now, and Ezekiel Elliott owners out there just absolutely panicking, right? Yeah, well, deservedly so, because for 3 straight weeks, he's done nothing but disappoint them. Sure, the volume is still there. The volume you want to see is still there. He's just not doing a whole lot with it. Over his last 3 games, played 0 touchdowns, only averaging 3.6 yards per carry. But the real kick in the nuts, only 2 receptions combined over the last 2 games. That was kind of what was giving Zeke a safe floor early on in the season. Without those receptions, oh dear Lord, we should be in for a tough second half of the year for Ezekiel Elliott. Can you afford to sit him against the Pittsburgh Steelers, who only allow 15.3 fantasy points per game? Probably not, right? You got to continue to roll through it, but if you can find somebody to trade off Ezekiel Elliott, maybe the first place, second place owner there is willing to give up something and just take that gamble, I would at least start to shop him around to see what you can get, if anything, at this point. Just don't give him away, right? You're not trying to give him away. You're trying to get something back in return, but maybe you can kind of upsell it as, hey, second half of the season, he's going to turn it on, because with all the banged up offensive line issues and the quarterback issues, it could be ugly for Ezekiel Elliott in a tough schedule here for the next few weeks, but you can't really afford to sit him if you got him. For Pittsburgh, James Conner just continues to be pretty consistent, right? I mean, he has that touchdown upside on a weekly basis, has at least 1 touchdown 5 of his last 6 games played, plus the volume is there, getting over 18 touches a week since week 2. Dallas allows over 21 fantasy points per game. Absolutely, I have no issues starting James Conner once again for this offense in Pittsburgh, going up against the defense of the Dallas Cowboys. On to the rematch of the Saints and Bucks now, and as of right now, the Bucks are currently the number 1 team against opposing running backs, allowing only 12.8 fantasy points per game. Number 1 in the NFL. So does that mean that we should worry about Alvin Kamara? Not really. I mean, the dude is the number 1 running back in fantasy football, averaging over 24 fantasy points per game. And he doesn't need a whole lot of carries on the ground, right? He's only gone over 14 carries once all year long. His bread and butter is in the passing game, averaging right around 8 receptions a game, and he's almost at 1,000 yards total on the season already. Currently sitting at 987 total yards. Maybe Michael Thomas comes back, but it doesn't really matter. You're still starting Alvin Kamara. For Tampa Bay, did Rojo fumble away his job to Leonard Fournette again? I mean, he saw 11 touches, but that's the lowest he's seen since week 2. He was outcarried on the ground by Fournette 15-7, and Fournette actually saw 73% of the snaps and was a pretty close game here this past week. Going up against the Saints, who allow only 14.9 fantasy points per game, which is 6th best in the NFL, both these guys have a limited ceiling. With the volume concerns, though, right now Leonard Fournette may be slightly safer. He was already more active in the passing game, and then Ronald Jones getting another fumble and Bruce Arians holding grudges really just points to all things going towards Leonard Fournette. Yes, Ronald Jones is going to be involved. He just can't seem to get out of his own way at times, and as of right now, Leonard Fournette just seems a little bit safer. I'll start Fournette. I have Rojo listed as a sit, but let's be realistic. I mean, it could be either one of these guys. It's a hot hand approach, and there's no, consistency with Bruce Arians whatsoever. Like I said, I have him listed as a sit. If you have no better options, I don't hate starting Ronald Jones. Just know he could be in the doghouse early and really hurt your fantasy team here moving forward. Monday Night Football, New England Patriots, New York Jets, and may not be the best of games to watch on Monday Night Football, right? I mean, Damian Harris looks great at times. He's coming off his best game of the season there in Week 8. And honestly, the kid looks good whenever he gets volume. He's got over 100 yards rushing every time he gets at least 15 rush attempts. The problem is, he doesn't get 15 rush attempts all that often, which makes him a little bit more of a risky start. James White, he's not overly involved in the offense. He only has 3 receptions total over the last 2 games combined. It's really hard to know which New England team is going to show up on a weekly basis. And we've said it for years, right? This backfield is already difficult to figure out. Then you factor in the Cam Newton issue and whether he's going to take goal line carries. I mean, it's just impossible to figure out. In my opinion, right now the best option in this backfield is Damian Harris, but he needs to get the volume. If the kid can cross the 15 rush attempt threshold, he's a solid flex play for me here this week, and that's where I got it. Nobody else in this backfield am I going to risk it on as of right now. For the Jets, it's the Jets, and I still can't trust either one of these guys, and I have to think that you have better options here going forward. Neither Frank Gore or LaMichael Pirine very active in the passing game. The Jets constantly trailing and not able to focus on the ground game. Even though the Patriots allow 21 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs, I can't see either one of these guys getting close to that number. And in my opinion, not worth the risk. Not going to trust them. Sitting both guys here for the New York Jets. All right, those are my starts and sits for the running back position here, Week 9 fantasy football. Hopefully that helped make a few of your decisions a little bit easier. I do want to leave you guys a little bit of a reminder, though. Any updates throughout the week, because things change on a moment's notice in the NFL. We'll have updates in our running back rankings videos and on our Saturday Night Live show, so make sure you tune into both of those to get the most updated information, right? We got to make sure we know what's going on with Aaron Jones and Chris Carson to really get these lineups set and dialed in for this weekend's matchup. We greatly appreciate the support. Looking forward to talking to you guys here throughout the week. Have a great rest of your day, and we'll talk to you later. Thanks.